lights here.
So Charles, is this Len's version that you're bringing up?
Yep. Can you guys see my screen with your comments in red and then Len's subsequent comments in the burgundy?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. Sorry it's so late, but anyway.
No, thanks for getting them to us. So were we a go with the session and a motion to begin the meeting, or were we waiting on?
Sorry, Charles, cut you off. I just started the live stream, so you guys are ready to go.
Great, thanks, Joe.
You got it.
So motion to open the September meeting of the Budget Advisory Committee.
So moved.
Second.
Great. So I think we have essentially everyone except John Fall, who is still on the committee. And I think we still need to kind of revisit that at some point.
Charles, I thought John had said a few months ago that he really no longer wanted to be on the committee, but I don't think he ever officially resigned.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, he was going to stay on in like an advisory capacity, and as was Michael. Michael has moved, so he won't be available. And then, do we actually? Is Ed on?
No.
We don't have Ed. Okay, we actually don't have Ed. So yeah, I guess with that, we'll have. It would be December, I think, that John's term might be up, but we need to revisit that. But irrespectively, to try to, as we did with Ed, to fill that role, and then John Fall indicated he would be willing to, remain connected to us in an advisory role. So if we, and I'm jumping around here, but if we as a point, if we can look to see when John Fall's term expires, and then assuming that it is in December, which I believe it is, and then see if we can find somebody. If not December, Dan Natchez, do you know what the process would be? Would he would have to formally resign then?
Well, if his term is up, he doesn't have to resign in December. If his term is not up, he should resign.
Right. And if his term is up and we find somebody in advance of December, rather than losing those 3 months, I think my understanding is that he would be willing to resign. So point being, if we can put the feelers out there to find somebody.
I'll contact Sally tomorrow and ask her to put a notice out to the village.
Okay, great. But yeah, it's great that we have, the attendance of everybody on, and this group has been pretty consistent, which is great. So that being said, before going into the agenda, which would be focusing on preparation with this document being finalized, and then what our game plan and talking points would be for the Board of Trustees meeting on the 24th. And then, kind of a recap of next steps with the subcommittees. We did have some action items from last month, a number of which have already been, moved forward. One was, the timing and the request being put forth to accelerate the, schedule throughout the whole process by 1 month, and Dan Natchez had initiated that, which is great. I guess with that, Jerry, is that something you guys are in discussions about, and whether that's realistic, and what the next steps would be in terms of trying to memorialize that, and so that we can kind of structure the remainder of the year with our schedule to kind of be in line with that?
I think Jerry stepped away because we got a chat that said it just said, I'll be right back. So I'm not sure, Charles, if Jerry's at his desk.
Got it. Okay, we can come back to that.
Yeah.
So that was one. And then I had a note that, and I will try to summarize our minutes so that we can reference them. And I'm, certainly a couple of meetings behind on that. But in referencing the minutes from last month, a note that Ellen was going to try to get with Jerry to talk about revenue.
Right,
And
what we could be looking at next. I did reach out to Jerry, and Jerry said the request really needs to come from the board. And I then spoke with Dan Natchez, and Dan was going to follow up with Jerry, so I don't know where that stands.
So Dan and I spoke, and the one thing that Dan doesn't know about, but we've been trying to do here in the manager's office, because we handle all the insurances and the claims and the payment of the deductibles and things like that. We've started looking into some of the past insurance claims as well as the deductibles that we've paid, and working on it for a couple of weeks now with just one staff member who is my office assistant, Karen Johnson. We've been able to uncover what looks like to date about $76,000 in deductibles and claims that we've paid that we shouldn't have paid. So we started the process of submitting the request for reimbursements to the insurance company, of which they've committed to about $72,000 so far.
That's
and
great.
That's the tip of the iceberg. So we have a need here for someone to, or a small committee to assist Karen in looking through some of the things that the manager's office may not have been able to keep track of in the past as effectively as they should have, with lack of staff, some turnover, a lot of different reasons. And so while Karen is very good and very persistent on the phone and follows up and is organized, she doesn't have a financial background. She doesn't have a background in government. She's pretty new here. She's only been here with me for about a year, a little bit more than a year. So there might be an opportunity for a subcommittee to be able to look into and help out and try to figure out, maybe developing a system to look past, to look back in the past to see if we can find more items just like, I just described. In essence, like an audit type of process.
I'm happy to help with that if somebody wants to show me what it is I'm looking at and
Yeah,
what
so-
I'm looking for.
Yeah, so Karen's getting pretty good at it, and I spoke to her right around 5 o'clock this afternoon, and she said that she would appreciate the help, but also appreciate finance eyes on it, because she really doesn't have that look to it. She just knows how to be persistent, and that's so far has paid off for us. So there are always these areas that, when we turn over these large boulders and we find things underneath that are present in government, because it's fast paced, but we're slow in trying to follow up with what we need to follow up. So that's one area. Another area is an examination of the court. The court historically has brought in significant amount of money for the village. Typically, they bring in more than what we've paid out in salaries and expenses. But there may be a way of becoming a little bit more efficient in the court, or just like we did with the police, figure out what our costs are and try to determine, if there's ways of even bringing in more money. We're in the positive, according to Augie, 30 to 40,000 every year with the court. So with a department that brings in well over $1 million, that's almost break even. And it could get a little critical at some point. I can tell you this year, we budgeted 960,000 in fines and forfeiture revenue, and we've collected 0 to date, 0. 3 months. Right. So if there's ever a time to see if there's a way to streamline the not necessarily the court process, but to look at, how much it's costing us, how much they're bringing in, where we can make some adjustments, if consolidation makes sense with other courts, those kinds of things. Those are, I'm talking about 2 pretty large tasks that I know my office staff, with me, Dan Sonoff, Courtney, and Karen, and the auditors. When I say auditors, I'm talking about Jonathan Covino, who works for us, and Augie Fusco. They're both from they both are auditing. They have an auditing background, and they don't have time to look into this kind of and dive deep into it. Those are the 2 things I have that potentially could be a subcommittee focus for this year.
I think that, thanks for sharing that. It's a really good sequitur, and we can hopefully dive a little bit deeper into that, per
Okay.
Ellen's question, and run with it. But I think it's a good sequitur to a couple of things. One was that in our last meeting, we talked about trying to make it, our practice, September, October, November, let's say, to get feedback from you in relative real time as to, the status of how we're trending, and, where there might be significant variances, and letting you present some of those bullet points for us to, evaluate. So
I can do that now, Charles, but I don't want to disrupt the flow of the meeting.
no, that, and I am jumping around a bit, but as a recap from last month's minutes, if everybody's in agreement, if we, for these next 3 meetings, as we, effectively agreed to last month, make it our practice to let Jerry provide, that overview and those updates as a means by which for us to keep our finger on the pulse with what he sees critical variances and trends, positive or negative, being, and then our being able to, determine how to look further into that, and how we as a group and also as a subcommittee want to maybe go further. A good example of that would be, a couple of the things that were just raised, maybe historical, but also current, as a good example of that. And then jumping ahead, but tying this in with the subcommittees being something we touched on last month, and if we maybe try to tie this in, I think the capital budget subcommittee that, Len and John Campbell and I were, officially on, but that obviously everybody has contributed to this document and jumped into that space. If we keep that as a subcommittee focusing on the capital budget with, if it ends up being the entire group's participation, that's great as well. I think, Len and I talked about some micro things we wanted to maybe get into, with John Campbell, and then Augie in terms of amortization schedules and the like. We could talk about that offline, but that's one. And then the second was this broad revenue and expense subcommittee, which is a loaded, broad world. But we've already now, through what you just presented, Jerry, touched on things that broad subcommittee could be working on at a more targeted level.
Yep. And then with the committee members of, let's say,
And then with the committee members of, let's say, 3 or 4 subcommittees, we could, maybe try to tie this in with, if everybody's in agreement, make it our practice to let Jerry provide, that overview and those updates as a means by which for us to, keep our finger on the pulse with what he sees critical variances and trends, positive or negative, being, and then our being able to, determine how to look further into that, and how we as a group and also as a subcommittee want to maybe go further. A good example of that would be, a couple of the things that were just raised, Ed, Ellen, and Bill being available maybe to tackle some of those projects, that's how we could, for the time being, structure the subcommittee framework, with the waterworks being on hold upon further review. Does that kind of sound reasonable to everybody as kind of a jumping off point? And then maybe Ellen could talk a little bit further, if we're in agreement with that, about some of the points that Jerry just made as recommendations for that subcommittee to look at.
I think that's reasonable.
Sounds good.
Okay,
Sounds
cool.
good to me too. So.
Seems good to me.
And I don't know that we need any formal motions. I think we have these in place. If you guys feel like we need to further memorialize any of that, we can, but I think we're kind of up and running, and we can continue if everyone's okay with that.
Could I ask a question, Charles? It's Len.
Sure. Hey, Len.
Jerry, just from an overview picture of this fiscal year, how do you see us, either within budget, above, below? What's your sense overall? I'm asking because you sort of gave us an issue about 980,000 or so in the budget on court revenue, but let's say collections thus far is rather limited.
Yes.
So I don't know if you're looking at going, the rest of this year, and if you have any thoughts.
So I can tell you where we are just as a picture this year. And one thing, going back to Bill's point, is that state aid, we receive about 150,000 a year in state aid. We don't receive millions like the cities do, like the city of Rye or the city of White Plains. So a 20% hit for us would be about $30,000.
Yeah.
So that's a hit, but it's not one of those devastating hits like a $400,000 hit that the city of Rye may receive. What's down in the village, our general parking permits are down 24%, and that's about $23,000. We're still selling a few here and there, but not as many as we have last year or as we budgeted. Our on-street parking is down 10% from this time last year, which when I looked at that number today is surprising, because I thought we were down even more than that. So our 10%, our on-street parking has rebounded significantly since the restaurants started to open up again. What is up for us, Harbor Island Park, which we just closed out yesterday, is up 38% from what we budgeted. The beach revenue is up 167% from what we budgeted.
Wow.
And building permits are up 8% from this time last year.
Wow.
Right.
How does that compare to what we budgeted though, Jerry?
Yeah, so what we budgeted, I can give it to you real quick. So we budgeted 692,000 in general permits. We've collected 220 so far. So we're at 31.65% of expected revenue. Our expenses are up. They're running about 5% higher than they should right now. We're at 25% of the year, but our expenses are at 29.4%. And I can tell you one of the reasons why that is. During the early days of the pandemic, we laid off part-time staff. We laid off crossing guards. We laid off court staff. And what we do with and I'm just going to try to bring up so that I can call it exactly what it is. We have an unemployment reimbursable bill. Basically, the unemployment that a laid off employee collects is accumulated, and we're billed that amount of money. It's not insurance where we pay a portion of it. It is actually the bill for the individual. So if the individual collects $175 a week in unemployment, we pay $175, which is billed to us by the Unemployment Insurance Division of the Department of Labor. That is, we're at 130% of what we budgeted. That should be at 25%. We're at 130%.
Did we accrue for any of this for last year?
No, so what ended up happening is we didn't anticipate laying off these individuals because we had them in the budget. And what we did was we cut them out of the budget. Some of them, not the court staff, but some of the others. But they're collecting unemployment now. So they're costing us whatever the unemployment insurance payment is
Right.
costing us. So I lost my video now. Okay, here it is. So that's an item that's going to have to, we're going to have to make an adjustment. I'm going to have to talk to the board and see. We are looking for those people to come off unemployment, and they will. Most of them are crossing guards. And the crossing guards will come back to us very soon, within a day, and start to work. So we have our budgeted number. We do need to make a $14,000 adjustment because the school has decided to go to a split session. So we need crossing guards. We need double the amount of crossing guards at the elementary schools. So that's a $35,000 hit, but we only need to make a transfer of 14,000, which will come up in the next at the next meeting.
So Jerry, I have a question. I'm sorry. You had mentioned that general parking was down. What about, does that include railroad parking?
No, so railroad parking, I can't give you a forecast on railroad parking because those are collected in March of 2021, Ellen. So right now we're at 0. I couldn't give you a forecast of what that's going to be. I could give it to you in April, but I can't give it to you now.
No, so I guess it was at the last meeting or the meeting before, Dan Sarnoff had mentioned that we were giving people refunds for the full year parking permit.
We've given out.
But what I was wondering though is now that some people are going back to work, have we reissued permits?
No, we're still in the negative about 6,000 of the refunds we gave.
Okay.
We go back to the 960 that, so it was budgeted and 0's been collected. So you're 960 in the red on fines.
Yeah, so this time, Charles, this was the 960. We should have had, in theory, 25% of that if the court was allowed to open on June 1. But the court is having some sessions, but they're not collecting fines. They're not operating in the full capacity as a court would operate.
Okay, so the run rate would be, at 960, you should be at 25%, about $250,000.
Correct.
And those issued fines with the courts not collecting, how is that treated as does it hold until they open? If people are still responsible for the fine, or are they forgiven?
No, it holds until they open and until the court starts to run a docket and put those people on the docket to either collect their ticket or set up a trial.
Got it. Okay.
So Jerry, with all the ups and downs, with most of the downs rather than the ups, where do we net out?
So I don't have that because I didn't have time because I was still finishing out the FEMA report today, but I didn't have time to do that net out thing that you had asked last time. But you did have, and I don't know if you shared it with the committee yet, but you did have those numbers that Augie presented, the way you asked me to present them to you. I could look it up. I don't know if you wanted to share
I
that.
forwarded that to the committee.
Okay, good. Okay.
Okay, so maybe for next month, we could circle back on that net number, kind of continue with
Yeah.
this type of an exercise.
Yeah. I mean, other than the court and some uncertainty with the parking, I'm not sure if we're going to have much of an issue collecting our revenue. Our police traffic detail reimbursement, we've only used 5%. I mean, we've only collected 5%, but we haven't spent. That's a direct replenishment. We collect what we spend.
Sales tax?
Yeah.
So taxes, so sales tax, we were up last time. I'm waiting for the next disbursement. And the next
Up year over year to
Yeah.
date.
Yep, up year over year. Yep.
That's
Okay.
unreal. Wow.
Yeah,
And
that's a surprise.
It's due to the internet sales collecting
Yeah.
tax, as well as the 1% increase, which helped us.
Wow.
As far as
versus, I think,
property tax, we're at 100%. We're at 99.81% of property taxes collected.
Wow.
it's just incredible.
Okay.
And countywide on the sales tax, I think you guys had reported like 10 to 15% down versus neighboring counties that were like 30 to 40. So for us to be flat, I don't know what Westchester's at, but it's just remarkable. So
It is. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so the real, and I can't recall, it was, let me see, May 10. It could be as soon as next week, Charles, where we get our tax payment, our sales tax payment, or sales tax distribution. But I could be off by 1 month, but that's why I rely on Augie to remember those dates for me.
great.
No, by next meeting.
But
Well,
yeah,
thank you,
that's
Jerry.
great.
Thank you, Jerry. That's a much better report than I, quite frankly, would have contemplated, especially on sales tax, for example.
Yeah.
I do have to, though, keep an eye on the expenses because we're about 5% over right now where we should be. So
Yeah.
I'll be talking to my staff about that and taking a look at those kinds of things.
Yeah, Jerry, just for information, when you, on sales tax, you said was made up by internet sales. So when someone buys from Amazon and pays a sales tax, there's an allocation of a portion of that sales tax to the village?
So the sales tax gets collected by the county bill, and then we get an allocation of that sales tax.
Right.
Jerry, one follow-up. I think you had stepped away and we had the note from last month to circle back with you on, whether we put together, our committee schedule to in some ways mirror the schedule that, we've conferred with you about over the last year, how you guys are operating with respect to a schedule.
Sure.
And we felt like we were all coming down to the wire, particularly at the back end of the process, kind of under the gun and really needing to, over accelerate recommendations and the like. So we discussed by pulling the schedule back a month that might afford us the window to be able to be more effective, particularly at the back end. Are you comfortable trying to, put that forth to move everything up essentially a month?
So it would be, what would be draft to, if you have that schedule in front of you, because I don't have it, Charles, but what would be the draft, the date of the draft to the Board of Trustees? And then I'll tell you what that is.
In March.
Are we in March?
Didn't something come out recently that the board asked for the budgets to be completed in January?
That was you guys.
No.
My board? Not my board. Not the Board of Trustees.
I know,
I was
all,
working with Dan. I was working with Dan on trying to fulfill a request of the budget committee to try to move up the process a little bit.
Yeah, that's correct.
That was
That's
the
what
email
we
you were
talked about last time.
so I misread that email that came out a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I think if I can, I vaguely recall last year's schedule because a lot has gone on since, but I think we can move that up 30 days and not have too much trouble.
Um,
I don't know if it's handy on your computer, Charles.
yeah, I'm gonna see if I can just pull it up.
Hey, Ed, there's Ed. Ed's here. We didn't see it before. And the reason I could is last year we had a challenge. Well, I presented a challenge to the department heads, which was a capital budget, worksheets, and detail. And so that has been completed. That maybe needs to be fine-tuned a little bit, but the reality is not much. So we're taking 2021 numbers and we're making them 21-22 numbers because we've been somewhat at a standstill as far as capital investment items and improvements this year. We spent a little bit of money, but not a lot.
So in terms of the operating budget, I know one of the things that we cut out this year, or a bunch of things that we cut out, were around a lot of the events, whether it be the concerts or the block parties, whatever. Do you know if there's going to be an appetite for putting that back in?
No, I don't know. There is an appetite, Ellen, for things to get back to normal.
Yep.
If I can put it that way. But as far as not having those events this year, it's understood. I'm not getting any push from the public that we're not having events and, those kinds of things.
Right. I'm just wondering about, if a lot of the stuff happens in the summer. So if the expectation would be that we have some of those things next summer, in which case I also think, which is one of the things we discussed months ago, we should take a look at all-in costs for each event.
Should.
So we make an intelligent decision about what goes back in the budget.
Right, but and I agree with you, but I'm pretty confident that in April, we will have an understanding of what kind of summer we're going to have, April of 2021.
Okay.
We will have a good understanding of and if that's the case, then we just leave them out again one more year if it's going to be a summer similar to this summer. We'll know in April. That's the benefit of we benefited significantly from the way our year falls on June, starts on June 1. The town of Mamaroneck, speaking with Steve Altieri, was not as fortunate because they had to have their budget, in at the end of December, beginning of January. And of course, things changed in March, first week of March. So we were able to make the cuts that we needed to make. So you have detailed review of adopted budget in January, but that's of this year's adopted budget. And then I see February committee recommends to be provided by end of February. Recommendations late. Okay, March, review status of draft budget due end of March. So we can change that to end of February, Charles, if that works and helps the committee grab an extra 30 days.
I think that would be significant. I don't know if everybody else agrees. I mean, the other challenge is that, if that were available, but then the work sessions still were held in mid-April, would the work sessions be able to kind of move in tandem?
The concept was to try and move the work sessions earlier because what happened this year is everything up at the last minute and a lot of things did not get focused on.
Right. So I wouldn't be able to dictate to the board when they schedule the meetings, but of course they can have that discussion. Sure. But if I'm asked to present a draft budget at the end of February, I'll be able to do that. As
Great.
far as when the work session meetings are scheduled with the BOT, that's on them.
So Charles, if the committee wants it, that might be a prong of the topic to discuss in 2 weeks with the board, not only the capital budget, but the budgeting process and timing, and trying to move things earlier.
That'd be great if you, depending on your agenda, if there's time to at least touch on that, that would be great.
What does moving the budget from March to February do for the work of the committee? It seems to mean that we have to get our work done sooner. I think if everything goes back a month, if everything gets a month earlier, I'm not sure if it's like dominoes or not. You know, if one date moves 30 days earlier, then do they all fall in sequence?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore requiring us to do whatever we plan to do from a budget review point of view, or the type of analytical work that Jerry has put on the table this evening about claims and what I call a program or process review for the courts.
Mm-hmm.
That condenses the time, I think. I haven't stepped through everything.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a catch-22. You know, the worksheets, as we know, were a real accomplishment by Jerry's office, and you know, with that, there's a massive amount of information to navigate and to try to prioritize. So, you know, that being accelerated and that being a core part of the initial recommendations from us becomes a bigger challenge. But then that's offset that we then have the broader window of time to, you know, review the draft budget, understand that presentation and make those recommendations.
But I think the other thing it does for us is if the board has any specific questions on either a department or given items, it gives us time to help with that analysis. You know, to Dan's point, a lot of stuff, and a lot of it was due to COVID, but you know, there's a lot of stuff going on at the last minute with things changing on the fly, and the board didn't have time to review it. We didn't have time to review. I mean, nobody had time to review anything. I think, you know, Jerry would finish revising something and would start all over again.
Yeah.
You know, the ink was never dry.
The tentative budget is due by April 1, regardless of when the work sessions start.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure. In my experience, the two budgets that I've been through, one that wasn't mine, that I was just brand new, stepping into my role, and then last year, the tentative budget is basically my communicating to the board where we are as far as the, where we are as far as the cap, whether within the cap, below the cap, above the cap, and the requirement of having the BOT adopt the budget by 4/1. It's almost like a formality. Then the real work starts. I don't know if real work can begin in March. That's a good question, Len.
Well, I mean, I think, sorry for beating this one to death, but if we move the March date a month earlier and the work sessions also go a month earlier, then effectively there's a 2-month gap between, or roughly, I guess, the work sessions and the tentative budget. And is that the best time for this committee
Mm.
to do our recommendations? Or actually, maybe we have from then until May for our recommendations, because we provide recommendations in April into May. So I'm just trying to,
But I think, Len, if the work sessions with the departments are done sooner, the tentative budget can incorporate any feedback from the board.
yes, but and from us as well.
Yep. And I think with the later schedule, you don't necessarily have that benefit.
That's correct. And that's my point. The benefit of moving things earlier and keeping the April 1st date does gives us more room for making recommendations. It forces us to do things sooner on the front end, like, this fall into December, but gives us some time for sharing our recommendations. I think. I don't know if the rest of you see it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Charles, I'm not sure or
I-
colleagues, what your reaction is.
I do think the work sessions moving forward as well are critical, and that's thank you for those who were the most proactive in attending them on our behalf, but there's a really a great benefit to being able to engage in that process, have mutual dialogue, be able to then integrate the feedback from that into the recommendations, and having that opportunity and pulling that forward would be very valuable, and then having a bigger window to get to the 4/1 and then ultimately to then retweak to the end of May.
Yeah.
So I guess that's something we can touch on as part of all of this. We will bridge it on the 24th and let the board think about if that makes sense, and if they can do that. And being that Jerry is comfortable moving his component forward, it seems like it would just make sense, but I guess that depends on what else you guys have going on, Dan, and what would be impacting that.
I think this is Dan. I think if we can try and move things forward, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then we're no worse off. But if it does work, and there is time, it gives more time to really reflect on what's being done, when you can look at things, after the work sessions and seeing, okay, now what's it all add up to, and do we want to do something more or less?
Mm-hmm.
This year we didn't have that luxury.
No, this year I caused budget fatigue with the department heads, because I made them work so hard on the capital budget. And then what we ended up doing is adopting a tentative budget on 4/1 and then completely revamping that budget by 5/20. Within 50 days, I had to create a brand new budget from scratch. So I don't suspect that'll happen next year, but then again, I didn't anticipate.
No, but it would,
Right.
but it does give a little bit more time.
Yeah.
Reflect upon, the substance of what's being done,
Mm-hmm.
the direction everybody wants to move and is comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
The work sessions are good, but it's fractionalized. And then you got to look at what it adds up to, because there's no such thing as a proposal that doesn't have merit.
Mm-hmm. But we can handle it on my end. We can handle 30 days on my end. How that shakes out for the rest of the BOT and this committee, that's to be seen. But I can handle the 30-day advance on my end.
Okay.
How large of a window do the 6 to 8 work sessions typically span? You know, was that, you know, X per week for how many weeks?
It'll go from the end of March, Charles, all the way to the end of April. It'll go for 4 weeks. There's a lot of scheduling conflicts, and then, you know, we end up doing back to back to back sometimes because we have five individuals with 5 different schedules, and so it gets a little complicated. But you could say, you know, we could typically do 2 work sessions a week on average, if that gives you an idea.
Yep. And it looks like, in looking at what we structured with our schedule, that the department worksheets being reviewed in December, that translates into you looking to get those from your department heads in December. Is you have a deadline for like end of November or into December?
Oh no, so these are yours. So I think letter A and letter B, I think would be of what the budget committee would be doing. I would get them in December, maybe early January, and then just start, you know, working them over. Detailed review of the adopted budget. See, B in January, detailed review of the adopted budget, I would assume is last year's budget, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Which is really ongoing.
Yeah, it's ongoing. Yeah.
And that also translates into what we're talking about doing, you know, monthly with you over the next 3 months,
Yeah.
which is, it's the, you know, the actuals versus the budgeted with respect to the adopted budget.
Right, sure. Yeah, so I wait for the holidays to end and then we start getting into those kinds of discussions.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take too long to work on those items.
Okay, so the worksheets, you're giving them a target of, it's like December into January?
Yep. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, cool. So we'll make it a point. Dan, I don't know if you want to, you know, rate so we don't blindside you guys on the 24th with asking that work sessions be moved forward, if that's something you could bridge preemptively, even if just
Consider it done.
Great. And that's probably a good sequitur, unless anybody had anything else with what we've thus far talked about, into that meeting and the document. I think you had mentioned, I think Dan, you had mentioned, you know, maybe targeting a half an hour for this, which, I mean, we could talk for 5 hours about that document, but what are you guys, you have an agenda? Is that realistically what we're targeting here?
You'll have as long as you need, but they targeted for 30 minutes, which is how it was set up. So my suggestion is that you bring it forward, bring whatever you guys decide to do, or in gals, to a to an action point of what you're trying to achieve, what you think the village should be trying to achieve, and how to do it.
Okay, that being said, I mean, is everybody comfortable with the edits that Ellen and Len put together with this? And we can, you know, make a motion to adopt the document as revised, and then that can be presented. I think it was a deadline of like the 19th to the board. And we can get through that tonight, and unless anybody had anything they wanted to further edit on the document, we could get through that and then go through it and talk about how we want to structure the time that we have, and what bullets, and just kind of what our strategy is with, you know, this work session with the board.
I'm comfortable with the edits, you know, including Len's.
Okay.
I'm trying to find Lynn's.
Do you see my screen up with the document?
No, we
You-
see the budget. We
You
see
have
the
you have your
budget,
schedule up.
deadline work agenda.
Okay, hold on. Let's do this and this. Any luck?
Yeah.
Yep, yeah.
Great. Okay.
Well, my question goes, it really comes back to the issue we discussed a little bit last time, is the issue of the word budgets. I mean, the board adopts a budget in May, effective June 1st. I'm not sure how a budget can account for something that happens after the budget is adopted. I'm not sure
Well, so,
what the process is.
and so maybe what we need to discuss with the board, since Jerry spent a whole lot of time with the department heads putting together a 5-year capital plan, that should be looked at. I'm not saying they should approve the capital work, but that should be looked at and get a sense of how much capital spending they're going to do.
Well, the board adopting any budget or any budget adopts a capital budget as well as an operating budget.
Yep.
So the board will be considering a capital budget, which Jerry has spelled out quite nicely in some detail over a period of time, and that'll be discussed earlier. But the capital budget has a number of potential sources of financing or funding. Some are grants, for example. But going into any fiscal year, we should know, as a matter of course, what we're expecting the capital budget to be and how much of that will be financed by the village. And Augie, as he does, maintains, a debt service schedule. And one thing that caused the confusion last time was that he only produces in the budget the debt service that's on the books and not the debt service that's anticipated in the upcoming budget year.
Correct.
And what we're suggesting, quite frankly, is that we anticipate the debt service falling off, the bonds being retired, as well as any new bonds, in order to be able to hit the threshold that the 7.5% that's been established. Now, I think most of us were led to understand, at least I certainly was, because we had the phrase $4 to $8 million that we could finance each year, presumably with no change in the debt service figure, but that's not exactly correct. So therefore, those were the edits that were made to this document. But I mean, I think the basic point here is that since a budget is a plan, we should be able to plan how much we're going to finance in the upcoming year.
And I think, Len, just to add to that, in a conversation I had with the mayor prior to our last meeting, he was under the impression that during the fiscal year, we do not issue new bonds. It's done at the end of the fiscal year.
That's correct.
And that's not the case.
Oh, okay.
Right. So
Sounded
that
like
was
that
was the belief, but we just issued, I believe Augie just issued a new bond last month, or he was getting ready to.
Which may have been an anomaly. That's a good question. How typical is that? Because I think the intention or the pattern had been that it would be at the end of the year. But to your point, it was just raised that there was one done mid-year.
Right. And this had just, well, it wasn't mid-year. It was early in our fiscal year.
Right.
Mid-calendar year. But
Mid-cal, yeah.
So the mayor thought it was towards the end of the fiscal year, not calendar year. And a lot of, when I was talking to Augie, it was after he sent out, or Dan forwarded to us, the debt service schedule for the new fire engine, which prompted me to question, is that $55,000 a year planned in the debt service? And if it hits this year, no, it's not. That's why we're making this edit. Because right off the bat, that would create an unfavorable variance to our operating plan.
Okay, but at previous meetings, Ellen, I thought that, as I understood it, the financings were done late in the fiscal year and not early.
Unless there's a need. You're right.
Okay, but was this year atypical or typical?
I don't know.
So,
We didn't have a bond sale late last year. This was for last year.
But it was done in this fiscal year and not planned for. The debt service wasn't in the plan.
But the debt service was for debt that we took on last year. It was
From
for-
what?
It was for all the items. It was for all the items, if I'm right, and I think if it's all the items that we were supposed to bond at the end of last year, we didn't bond at the end of last year because
Correct.
of the timing issue. We ended up doing it this year.
Correct. And in my conversation with Augie, the 3.7 million in the debt service plan for our current fiscal year was based on the bonds that were already on the books, not for this new issuance.
But not the new issuance, okay.
So any P&I associated with this new issuance is putting us over budget.
Mhm.
So that's what we're trying to address here.
But that 55 annual for the new fire truck, that doesn't start until next year.
Good.
Because we don't actually receive, we don't start to pay on it until we receive the apparatus.
Excellent. But I'm just bringing up that email correspondence is what prompted me to
Okay.
ask
I see.
Augie the question. So all we're trying to do in this document that we've all previously approved and the boards had,
Mhm.
so the only changes are these first couple of bullets,
Mhm.
was to close that gap, just to make sure if there is going to be a new debt issuance in the fiscal year that will impact our debt service plan, we should include those funds.
Mhm.
That's all we're trying to say.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay, so we've made a motion to approve this document, and Dan, I guess the idea is that we would like the board to make a motion to adopt it as a framework. And leading up to that, here's an opportunity for us to have live dialogue and make sure that we're on the same page.
So the procedure would be, my suggestion is you have to formally vote on this. Then I would suggest you present it to the board with 10 minutes, not more than 10 minutes of explanation, and then have a dialogue for, another 10 minutes. For the board to adopt it, they're going to want to talk about it at another work session as well. But you can, I think the recommendation is that this is the Budgets Committee recommendation for the board to adopt its policy. The policy is, like anything else, it is an approach or a plan, to follow as best one can do. I would also then, within, that takes up 20 minutes of the 30 minutes. And then I would spend the last 10 minutes on an approach to, speeding up the budget and work sessions and what you've just finished talking about for. So, I mean, that would be a suggestion that you may want to think about. I think it works much better when there is an organized presentation with specifics of action to be taken.
I think that's a good suggestion.
Absolutely. With that, would somebody like to make a motion to adopt the revised version of this framework as a committee so that we can go into the meeting with that in hand?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. would somebody like to volunteer to present the document and the bullets to the board, and then open it up to them for questions, and then with the goal of their, taking these recommendations and hopefully adopting it as a policy?
Oh, Charles, I think since you and Len are on the capital project subcommittee, shouldn't you two be presenting this?
Yep, I don't mind presenting it. I know you and Len worked extensively on this.
And Ed too.
And Ed, and then John is also on the subcommittee with Len and myself. So
Actually, I think Len did most of the writing here. He made it very easy for Ed and me, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
Len, I don't mind doing this, but would you like to present it if you're open to that?
Yeah, I'm open to it. Now, is the meeting the 24th?
28th.
Yes.
Yes.
I noticed that's a Thursday, so I was a little bit.
The 28th.
The 28th.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the 28th. Okay, I
weeks
thought I had
from
an
this
email
month.
that said the
I'm sorry,
28th.
it's the 28th, which is Monday.
Yeah, I saw the 24th. I thought I heard someone say the 24th. But
That's what the email says.
Okay.
Yep.
But the 28th works for me. That's a good
Christine
day.
Natchez. Do you want, Dan Natchez, do you want us to put a clean version of this on the backup?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to need a clean version of this, Charles, and then I can add it to the backup of the work session.
Yeah, just so you know, this will be at the work session, which starts on the 28th at 5 o'clock.
Yeah. 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock.
Okay, and that'll be via Zoom. Yeah, so I'll just adopt these, accept these changes in Word, and I guess get it into a PDF and get you a PDF, and
Good.
I'll CC everybody, and then that could be the document.
Good. We'll
Great.
add it. We'll add it to the agenda.
Wonderful.
We won't know in advance what time that presentation will be, huh, Dan?
Hopefully, if the board sticks to what it was recommended and agreed to by the board, it will be first on the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But the board doesn't always keep its.
Well, as they say, Dan, things happen.
But I will continue to remind everybody that that's what we did, because we allocated that we started at 5, so we would have 30 minutes for this. And if we're not either at the number one or near the beginning, the time gets cut.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that'd be great if we could jump in and.
Okay.
Great. Did anybody have anything else? Otherwise, we could make a motion to adjourn.
Before we adjourn, Jerry?
Yeah.
How do you want me to proceed with working on the two things you pointed out?
We will
What's
have
the next step?
we will have a Zoom introductory meeting.
Okay,
We'll send you an invite. I'll get
Okay.
Karen on there and she can explain a little bit about what's going on. That's with Karen. As far as the court and diving into the court, you'll need more hands on deck for that one.
okay.
That's a big one. There's a lot of detail in there.
Okay.
So from a process perspective, I do have a black belt in 6 Sigma.
Okay,
So
that's
if
good.
that's what's needed, I should be able to help with that.
Yep.
I will send out an email to the board tomorrow, reminding them that this is supposed to be first on the agenda on the 28th. But I think Charles and Len, you need to sort of organize your presentation.
Yeah.
For the for the capital project, and also a short discussion, after that, following up on, moving the budget up, faster, work sessions, et cetera. They will have that information beforehand as a heads up, but it's better if you're organized on that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Charles, you and I will have to have a conversation sometime over the next week or two.
That'd be great. We'll be in touch and look forward to it.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. So a motion to adjourn the September meeting of the Budget Advisory Committee.
I'll move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Hi,
Right.
hi,
You didn't
everyone.
ask about opposed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Likewise. Good night.
Good night.
Night,
Good
everyone.
night, all. Thank you.
Good night, guys.
All right.